The First Murder and Mao's Transformation. In the last episode, we explored a largely overlooked book by Chen Xiaoya, which sheds new light on Mao's early years and his rise to power. Today, we'll build on Chen's research to delve deeper into Mao's psychological shift following the highly probable murder of his close friend and fellow revolutionary, Peng Huang. This pivotal moment, closely linked to Mao's early use of violence and propaganda, is key to understanding the mindset and rationale behind the many purges he would later initiate. These purges, which plunged China into deep tragedy and suffering, were driven by Mao's increasing detachment from moral constraints, his ruthless ambition, and the psychological reinforcement from each success. By examining this psychological formation and his growing mastery of manipulative tactics, we can better understand the violent path Mao took to consolidate power, a path that ultimately led the nation to disaster. Chen's research suggests that this incident marks the first time Mao eliminated an obstacle through murder, setting the tone for his future approach to political power. The death of Peng Huang was not just a tragic loss of a friend, but a critical turning point that symbolized Mao's willingness to use extreme measures, including murder, to further his personal ambitions. Mao's decision to eliminate Peng was likely driven by his growing desire for power and control, as well as his increasing willingness to sacrifice anyone who posed a threat to his rise. From this point forward, Mao would continue to view violence and manipulation as necessary tools in his quest for power. The murder of Peng Huang wasn't an isolated event, but part of a broader pattern that would define Mao's political tactics, both within the Communist Party and in his personal life. Mao's use of murder, purges, and violence would become increasingly systematic as he consolidated his power, eventually leading to the mass atrocities of the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution. The psychological impact of Peng's death. The murder of Peng Huang had a profound psychological impact on Mao. At the time, Mao was a young and ambitious revolutionary with few resources, and the money he embezzled served as both a financial boon and a means to secure his position within the Communist Party. The initial success of this act of violence likely provided Mao with a sense of power and invincibility, which reinforced his belief that violence could be used to remove obstacles to his goals. Mao's actions after Peng's death exemplified a pattern that would define his career: the use of violence to achieve political ends. This, coupled with his ability to manipulate propaganda and control public perception, allowed him to ascend to the highest levels of power in China. Mao quickly learned that killing, or at least eliminating those who posed a threat to his ambition, was one of the most effective ways to secure his position. This began with Peng Huang, but it didn't stop there. Throughout Mao's rise to power, he consolidated control through purges, propaganda, and military action, regardless of the immediate outcome. The Autumn Harvest Uprising, despite its military failure, was a pivotal moment in Mao's early use of violence to assert dominance within the Communist Party. This event can be seen as an extension of tactics Mao likely began with the suspected murder of Peng Huang, using military action followed by purges to remove obstacles and clear the path for his ambitions, no matter the cost in lives, be they soldiers or civilians. Although the uprising was a setback, it laid the foundation for Mao's eventual dominance, showcasing his ability to turn failures into stepping stones toward power. At this early stage, when the CCP lacked a robust military presence, Mao skillfully turned military failures to his advantage. As the CCP grew in strength, Mao refined this approach, using both bloodshed and military success to cement his authority, all while painting a rosy picture of his actions through his mastery of propaganda. This would become a defining pattern in his climb to ultimate power. The Autumn Harvest Uprising and its aftermath. This pattern was evident throughout Mao Zedong's rise to power. The Autumn Harvest Uprising was his first attempt to expand this pattern to mass killing to gain power, this time military power. The Autumn Harvest Uprising of 1927, led by Mao Zedong, was a critical moment in his power-seizing strategy, reflecting his growing willingness to use violence and killing to achieve his goals. While the uprising ended in failure, with estimates of 3,000 to 5,000 deaths, Mao viewed the casualties, both military and civilian, as a necessary expense in his pursuit of power. The defeat and the subsequent loss of life did not deter him. Instead, it marked an important shift in Mao's approach, where he rationalized the deaths as part of the revolutionary struggle and an inevitable cost of concentrating power. The event also represented Mao's evolution into a leader who saw killing as a tool for solidifying his control and advancing his personal objectives, laying the groundwork for the violent tactics that would define his later campaigns. After the uprising, Mao faced dissent within his ranks, particularly from military leaders who had been educated at the Whampoa Military Academy and were seen as potential rivals. Mao accused them of disloyalty and desertion, framed them as traitors, because some of them had questioned his leadership and decisions. In response, Mao executed key figures like Chen Hao, Xu Shu, Han Changjian, and Huang Ziji, all of whom had held important military positions within the uprising. This violent consolidation of power shocked many revolutionaries, revealing Mao's readiness to eliminate perceived threats to his authority, even if it meant resorting to executions. This event marked a turning point in Mao's approach to leadership, where he increasingly saw purges as essential tools for ensuring his dominance within the Communist Party. In the book Mao, The Unknown Story, co-authored by Yung Chang and John Halliday, there is a chapter describing this period in Mao's life, where the authors highlight Mao's perverse enjoyment of public executions, particularly as a means to assert control over the population and reinforce his authority. Mao made killing class enemies a celebratory event, transforming it into a public spectacle designed to instill fear and compliance in the local population. During a rally in 1928, Mao's couplets pasted on red sheets explicitly called for the public execution of bad landlords and even used gruesome imagery like knife slicing upon knife. This event, marked by the execution of Kuo Weiqian, a local landlord, was not only a ritual of death, but a deliberate act of social control. While public executions were not new to China, Mao's innovation lay in organizing these as ritualized rallies with mandatory attendance. This served as a tool of terror to reinforce Mao's control and mold public perception of the revolution by normalizing violence and showing it as both necessary and legitimate in Mao's political agenda. Mao Zedong's use of public executions and violent purges, predating Stalin's consolidation of power in the Soviet Union, shows that instead of claims that Mao learned these tactics from Stalin, many or most of them were a product of Mao's own desire to assert control. Mao used fear and terror to eliminate enemies and solidify his authority, demonstrating his narcissistic and psychopathic approach to ruling. Mao's purges and mass campaigns. For Mao, the use of killing, whether directly or indirectly, became a routine way to eliminate anyone who stood in his way. It wasn't about revolution in the idealistic sense anymore. It was about solidifying his control at any cost. This ruthless pragmatism marked the dark side of his leadership, where power and survival trumped ideology or moral concerns. We won't go to further detail to other purges he started, but we are happy to list them here for your reference. Jiangxi Soviet Purge, 1928. After the failure of the Autumn Harvest Uprising, Mao executed a series of purges, labeling many comrades as traitors, leading to mass executions and arrests. Anti-Bolshevik Purge and the Suppression of Fusion Incident, 1930-31. The anti-Bolshevik purge was a major crackdown within Mao's own ranks, fueled by fabricated accusations. In May 1930, he accused his non-compliant comrades of being anti-Bolshevik, a label that was outdated, as the real anti-Bolshevik forces were a KMT organization and had already been dissolved. The purge led to an uprising against his violent tactics. Mao's response was swift and brutal. He accused the dissenters of betrayal and ordered the execution of hundreds. This event solidified Mao's reputation for using violence as a tool to eliminate internal threats and maintain control, further demonstrating his willingness to sacrifice his own ranks to secure absolute power. The Yan'an Rectification Campaign, 1942 to 1944. The Yan'an Rectification Campaign was designed to consolidate Mao's control over the Communist Party, while eliminating Soviet influences, dissent, and internal opposition. Presented as an effort at ideological rectification, the campaign quickly devolved into large-scale purges and show trials. Party members were coerced into confessing their supposed ideological errors, with many facing execution or imprisonment. A key figure, Wang Ming, was accused of left adventurism and nearly poisoned to death in the process. Land reform, 1947 to 1952. Mao initiated the land reform to redistribute land to peasants, but it quickly evolved into a mass purge targeting landlords, intellectuals, and local elites. The executions of these groups, ranging from landlords to members of the rural gentry, resulted in an estimated death toll of hundreds of thousands to millions. While the reform was framed as a means to empower the peasantry, its real purposes were twofold. First, to recruit soldiers and logistical support from the rural population to fight against the KMT forces in the Civil War, by making them believe the CCP served their best interests. And second, to dismantle the existing social structures, particularly the gentry class, in order to secure absolute control by the CCP. 3. Anti-campaign, 1951. This campaign focused on corruption, waste, and bureaucratic inefficiency within the party. It led to the public denouncement and punishment, imprisonment and execution of numerous officials accused of these crimes, solidifying Mao's control over the party and government. 5. Anti-campaign, 1952. This campaign targeted business people, focusing on bribery, tax evasion, theft of state assets, and other forms of economic crime. Thousands of business people and intellectuals were persecuted, with many suffering imprisonment, humiliation, or execution. Anti-rightist campaign, 1957. This was a direct purge of intellectuals and other perceived political rightists. Those accused of being counter-revolutionaries or dissenters were targeted, leading to arrests, public humiliation, and labor camp sentences. The Cultural Revolution, 1966 to 1976. The most infamous of Mao's campaigns, the Cultural Revolution, involved purges of intellectuals, party members, and perceived enemies of the revolution, particularly during the Red Guard phase. It led to the deaths of millions, widespread torture, and the destruction of cultural heritage. Throughout these purges, Mao consistently relied on violence, fabricated accusations, and the strategic use of public campaigns to eliminate perceived enemies, whether they were internal party rivals, intellectuals, landowners, capitalists, or those deemed to be ideologically unsound. His purges and mass campaigns were central to consolidating his power, using fear and terror to maintain control. These events were fundamental in shaping Mao's reign and demonstrating his unrelenting pursuit of power, where the human cost was never a concern. And these were just the purges. We haven't even talked about the Chinese Civil War, 1945-1949, and Mao's Great Famine, 1959-1961, with a casualty of millions and tens of millions respectively. These two events are inseparable from the purges as they further demonstrate the use of violence, lies, and manipulation on a national scale. Mao's strategies involved not just the elimination of political enemies, but also using his policies to inflict massive, unprovoked suffering on the Chinese population in his quest to reshape the country according to his vision. In short, the purges, the Civil War, and the Great Famine that was a tragic consequence of the Great Leap Forward were all part of the same cycle of terror and manipulation, where violence, forced obedience, and systematic removal of dissidents became the tools that Mao used to consolidate and maintain power, regardless of the price. Propaganda, aka lies, to achieve his goals. Alongside violence, propaganda became another cornerstone of Mao's strategy. He recognized the immense power of controlling the narrative and used it not only to justify his violent actions, but also to craft an image of himself as a revolutionary hero. Mao's first real orchestration of public opinion can be traced back to his service under Tan Yang Kai, after receiving 20,000 silver dollars. It was here that Mao began to shape his public persona, a process further cemented by his cover-up of the highly probable murder of Peng Huang. This critical act not only revealed his early skill at manipulating perception, but also marked the beginning of a pattern that grew more brazen in scale as his political ambitions deepened. The cult of Mao. Mao became a master of self-promotion. By the time he was consolidating his power in the 1940s, his image as the great leader was central to communist ideology. Mao used propaganda to craft a narrative where he was portrayed as the central figure in China's revolutionary struggle, creating a personality cult that elevated him above everyone else. The Great Leap Forward, 1958 to 1962. One of the most disastrous examples of Mao's use of propaganda was the Great Leap Forward, a campaign aimed at rapidly industrializing China. Despite the devastating famine that killed tens of millions, Mao used propaganda to portray the initiative as a great success, continuing to deny its failure long after it became clear that the brutal policies were causing widespread suffering and death. The Cultural Revolution, 1966 to 1976. During the Cultural Revolution, Mao used propaganda to frame his political rivals as enemies of the people, creating a narrative that justified the violence and chaos that followed. He mobilized the Red Guards, portraying them as true revolutionaries, fighting against a corrupt and bourgeois elite, notably moderate party members and the intellectuals. Once Mao had achieved his objectives, however, he swiftly moved to suppress the very force he had once hailed, revealing his readiness to exploit and abandon any group, seeing them merely as tools to serve his own purposes. Control over the media. Mao exercised tight control over the media, rewriting history and perpetuating a fictional version of reality that served his agenda. Historical figures and events were often distorted or erased entirely from official records to fit the narrative Mao sought to project. One notable example is Lin Biao, who, after a fallout with Mao and a failed attempt to flee China, died in an air crash. Despite his once prominent role in the party, Lin is still regarded as a traitor in CCP's official accounts. Perpetuation of Maoist ideology. Mao launched the Smashing the Four Olds campaign, 1966 to 1976, with the goal of eradicating China's traditional culture. Historical sites, books, art, temples, monasteries, and religious symbols were destroyed in a concerted effort to replace China's history with Maoist ideology. While framed as part of a revolution, the true objective was to solidify Mao's control over every aspect of Chinese life, ensuring that his ideology would dominate not only the present but also the past. This effort has striking parallels to the CCP's current treatment of minority groups and their religions, leading many to see Xi Jinping as reviving a Maoist-style totalitarian control, even after decades of reform and opening up. In Mao's regime, propaganda became as lethal a tool as violence. Through lies, manipulation, and revisionism, Mao was able to shape public opinion and justify his actions, no matter how destructive or morally bankrupt they were. His ability to control the narrative and present himself as a heroic figure while eliminating his critics helped him maintain control for decades, even as hundreds of millions suffered under his tyranny. The symbiosis of killing and propaganda. Mao's use of both violence and propaganda was not just complementary, but symbiotic. The violence eliminated threats and secured power, while the propaganda shaped public perception and justified Mao's brutality. Together, these two tools enabled Mao to create a controlled narrative of China's history and the revolution that allowed him to stay in power. In short, Mao's path from idealistic revolutionary to dictatorial tyrant was built on a foundation of lies, violence, and manipulation. He used killing as a tool to remove opponents, propaganda to construct his own myth, and ruthless pragmatism to pursue his own goals at the cost of millions of lives. This pattern, eliminating obstacles through violence and creating false narratives through propaganda, defined Mao's reign and set the stage for many of the most devastating chapters of 20th century China. This process can be understood through the lens of psychological reinforcement and self-justification, key elements in the behavior of many historical figures who commit atrocities for political gain. Each time Mao achieved a goal, his sense of invincibility grew, accompanied by a rationalization of his actions and further positive reinforcement of his belief that power consolidation through violence, propaganda, and killings was not only efficient but necessary. A closer examination of the many campaigns initiated by Mao reveals that he consistently achieved his objectives, emerging from each one not only intact, but with greater authority and an increasingly larger personal image as a dictator. Unfortunately, for the Chinese people, their descent into darkness and poverty was either blamed on themselves or scapegoated onto others. Few were able to see through the smoke and mirrors to recognize the true demon they were facing, Mao and the CCP regime that institutionalized his monstrous rule. In this episode, we built on Chen's research to explore the psychological formation of Mao and how it led to repeated purges becoming his established model of behavior. We traced the origins of such behavior to the highly probable murder of Peng Huang during his formative years. In the next episode, we'll reference memoirs from a few CCP cadres as supporting evidence of Mao's elimination of the first obstacle, Peng Huang, in his relentless pursuit of power and personal gain. Stay tuned.